Well, welcome, John. I'm so happy to have you here on Rendering Unconscious, and I'm so excited to talk about your new book.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa. And yeah, just to say, it's a really an honor to be here. And I love the podcast Running Unconscious and Dawson Bahagan and everything that kind of was associated with it. So yeah, great to be here.
I'm so happy to have you, and we'll talk later kind of how your trajectory has gone because you've been around for a while now. So it's really fun that you've now gotten to the point where you have your own book, and it's a very fantastic book on bridging kind of neuropsychoanalysis and ideas coming from neuropsychoanalysis with Lacanian psychoanalysis. How did this kind of combination come about?
Yeah, and as I was kind of looking at, I saw I think I haven't seen any sort of neuropsychoanalysis folks on the podcast, so it's kind of really exciting. And it really kind of came together as this kind of punctuating point in just the reading and the kind of studying that I've been doing. So you know, I started, and when I first got interested in psychoanalysis, I remember it was actually back in high school. Um, I had taken this like senior elective called Brain, Mind, and Soul.
Mm.
And it was the idea of it was sort of to think about like very basic sort of neuroscience, psychology, and theology. And the psychology portion was taught by the school's clinical psychologist, like the clinical school psychologist,
Mm.
and he was like old school trained, like in like the 50s. So the psychology for him was sort of classical ego psychology.
Mm.
So that's what I was exposed to, and I thought, wow, this is kind of cool. It's kind of wacky. It's kind of really weird, like all this ego, the censorship, sexuality, aggression stuff. But I found it interesting, an interesting way of sort of thinking about the mind. And then when we got to the neuroscience portion, and we had these like what was like those like the BBC Nova documentary stuff, and we sort of like see these like cool brain animations, and it talked about sort of balancing, say, like a prefrontal cortex response versus an amygdala response,
Mm.
sort of an impulsive amygdala response to a fear situation versus a prefrontal cortex sort of inhibited, sort of rational, controlled response. And I just thought like, huh, that sounds like vaguely similar to like ego id stuff that we just learned about. So I literally just Googled neuroscience psychoanalysis and I found the Neuropsychoanalysis Association, and I found Mark Solmes's work,
Mm.
and I started sort of watching and reading that, and I was just blown away. I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. This is so cool to think about the brain psychoanalytically, to
Mm.
think about the functioning of the brain psychoanalytically, and it's kind of been that's been the interest since then. And the Lacan piece, honestly, it comes from necessity. When I was in my undergrad, if the only psychoanalysis I could find was Freud and Lacan, there was nothing else. So I figured, okay, I might as well take these Lacan courses, and I learned a lot about these like wacky math themes and this. If I thought the Freud was difficult, then the Lacan was crazy. But I liked it, and I was sort of insistent on reading it alongside the neuroscience. And so as I kept reading things in neuropsychoanalysis, I was kind of bringing this Freudo-Lacanian lens to it. And yeah, that's kind of how the work evolved from the get-go.
That's so fantastic. And I love that it started in high school because I feel like so much is seeded in kind of adolescent years that really, yeah, can blossom into like our life paths. So that's so fantastic. And thank goodness for teachers teaching things like that nowadays still, you know?
Yeah, I sent a couple of years ago just like a thanks because the teacher retired and everything. Like, by the way, I'm still like, studying the things that you talked about. So just like, thanks for sharing it with me. It's really been formative.
That's so
Uh,
great. I had my favorite supervisor in grad school. I was trained like in a hospital and we were working with people like on dialysis and who were having transplants and things like that. So it was like very, you know, behavioral and cognitive behavioral things, very behavioral, really. But my supervisor was trained as an analyst, and he talked about looking at people through all the lenses. And I feel like that's really shaped me too. It's like you don't have to just look at people behaviorally or cognitively or psychoanalytically. You can look at different cases, like the case through these different lenses and see different aspects of people and how everybody has all of these aspects. So to me, that seems like perfectly natural. Like they all have their place, and it shouldn't be like, no, I only look through this lens, or I only look through this lens. It's like, but there's so many different things going on with humans.
Yeah, and I think it kind of like it encourages your flexibility, encourages sort of not being like siloed in how you think. And sort of speaking of the kind of trajectory, so when I was doing my undergrad, my courses were very siloed. Like I was in a very sort of cognitive science psychology department, and there was minimal psychoanalysis, very little, only in maybe two classes as like a part, like a tiny portion of the class or like a subtle element, but not really connected with anything else. And then, of course, all the psychoanalysis courses were in humanities departments,
Mm.
philosophy, comparative literature, modern culture and media. So yeah, and I think there was maybe a little of my I don't know opposition to whatever the symbolic authority was for the way that was set up. They're like, no, I want to put these together, even if it seems like at least disciplinarily that they don't get along.
But they sure
But
do.
it's
And
yeah.
you have shown that. Should we talk about a few of the different kind of concepts that you linked, or
Sure, yeah, and just to just while I'm thinking about high school and adolescence, to share because so the book in particular, it focuses on jouissance. It focuses on this Lacanian notion, right, of sort of excess, the sort of excess of pleasure that may not necessarily be pleasurable. It's sort of the chief sort of paradox that one of the chief paradoxes Lacan likes to kind of work with, and I've found it really sort of compelling, and especially because I think within the neuropsychoanalytic work and within the field of neuropsychoanalysis, I can talk more about affective neuroscience maybe later on. But I think this idea of jouissance is really kind of not there. Or if it's there, it's seen more as kind of more symptomatic, not in a symptomatic Lacanian sense, but more as kind of like, oh, this is more of a problem versus something that's constitutive. And it's funny because I remember in high school when I gave like a little presentation on some of the neuropsychoanalysis stuff that I had been reading, and I talk about this story in the book. I forget one of the first chapters. And I had a friend because I was on like a Freud kick and just like analyzing and sort of interpreting everyone Freudianly as one does when one first begins reading psychoanalysis. And I had a friend who would like love to tease me on like John, don't you think Freud makes everything about sex? It's not all about the penis and everything. And I was very kind of defensive as I was reading the neuropsychoanalysis stuff, and I was saying how, well, no, it's not only about lust, from affective neuroscience, from these studies of sort of basic emotions that are found across mammals, including humans, basic sort of emotional command systems that have been interpreted as sort of a new drive theory. There's not only sex, there's also aggression, there's also attachment needs, there's also needs for safety, sort of needs to keep one safe from harm. There's also needs to care for others, needs to play. Humans need, mammals need to play. So I sort of would shoot back like, well, no, it's not only about sex and all this stuff. And I remember he asked this question during the presentation, and I had been like flipping around the slides, and I basically repeated that, and I concluded it with saying, and I'm like gesticulating, guys, psychoanalysis isn't about sex. And it was so funny because right behind me on the PowerPoint, I had up Freud's psychosexual stages, oral, anal, phallic, genital, as I'm like shouting at everyone, psychoanalysis is not about sex. And like, so in looking back, I find it's just kind of so funny. And in a way, I think the book is an attempt to kind of situate properly psychoanalytic sexuality in the lens of jouissance as something that is excessive, that doesn't only show up in sort of veterinary sexuality, as is maybe studied in other fields, but as something that is central to not only how we think about the brain, but even central to how the brain operates.
Wonderful. And it's such a psychoanalytic scene right there. That could
Yes,
be out of a Woody Allen film.
that's great.
Yeah, and jouissance is not the first thing I think of when I think about neurology or neuropsychoanalysis in any way.
Yeah, it's so yeah, so maybe to get into that a little bit. So I mentioned the sort of basic emotion idea, and in case folks aren't familiar with that. So there is this wonderful researcher. He passed away, oh gosh, I think in 2017. I never actually got to meet him, Jaak Panksepp.
Mm.
And he did these decades and decades of very important research on basic emotional processes and circuits in the mammalian brain.
Mm.
So he did primarily animal studies. And his work documented several sort of primary emotional systems, which have sort of distinct neurocircuitry that can be selectively activated with either different pharmacological cascades or deep brain stimulation. And they give rise to characteristic behaviors, characteristic sort of innate instinctual responses. So, for example, one of the primary ones is what he calls the seeking system. Seeking. It's also it's very well studied elsewhere, especially in addictions literature. The sort of wanting system, or sort of the reward system in the brain. This is
Mm.
that same system. Panksepp calls it the seeking system because he notes that in its sort of primal state, activation of this system, it's associated with this sort of enthusiastic optimism for sort of what's out there. He
Mm.
calls it a goad without a goal. Sort of that something good is going to happen, and I'm going to sort of be very excited and optimistic and enthusiastic and excited and energized about going out, whatever. If you take like a dog to an open field, the what does the dog do? The dog runs around, he sniffs, he explores, what's this over there? What's that over there? That's sort of seeking. It's this sort of foraging kind of behavior. If anyone has been so naughty as to do cocaine or methamphetamines, this is the system that's chiefly activated, and it has this one certain kind of excitation and also a certain kind of pleasure. It feels good in a particular way that is very different from the feeling good associated with, say, when you're starving and you finally get to eat. That hunger satiation, that is another kind of pleasure that feels good, but in a qualitatively different way, and also a way that feels qualitatively different from, say, taking heroin or other kinds of opiates. That these are different sort of brain circuits that have different kinds of pleasure and unpleasure associated with them.
Mm.
Um, so Panksepp documented these different sort of basic emotional systems throughout the brain, and he argued that they all function homeostatically. And the idea is that, this sort of fits very easily with Freud's pleasure principle, the idea that sort of certain deviations or increases are felt as unpleasure in a particular way, and moving toward those sort of homeostatic set points feel good, feel pleasurable in a particular way. So, for example, there's an innate system called fear, which wants me to stay safe from bodily harm. So when someone's coming at me with a knife, I feel a certain kind of unpleasure, one that feels different, say, from being separated excuse me, from a caregiver, but they're coming at me with a knife that feels very bad. I'm going to run away. And when I finally get to safety, that feeling of safety is a particular feeling good.
Mm.
So you have sort of a threat, and then sort of this it's innate instinctual response to then deal with the threat. So this is kind of the idea of sort of these basic emotions in affective neuroscience. And within neuropsychoanalysis, these are taken up quite homeostatically. And I can already, I can hear the potential critical Lacanian ears of, well, okay, you guys are talking about instincts. We Lacanians, we in psychoanalysis, we talk about drives. We talk about what's not the innate response. We talk about how drive is, shaped and this sort of defiling of our innate responses by language, by culture, by our social relationships. Um, and so I try to introduce that element into these systems to say that, okay, look, yes, there are these innate responses, but they're considerably changed by learning, one. And two, more fundamentally, at the level of these innate systems, they already conflict with each other. And this is where I think it's sort of something in particular that I try to develop in the book. And in the book, I go into more detail on how exactly they conflict. But the basic idea is that the homeostasis associated, say, with fear is different from the homeostasis associated with hunger, is different from the homeostasis associated with seeking, is different from the homeostasis associated with attachment and caregiver bonding and all of that stuff. And because there's not one homeostasis, that there are homeostases, there's a plurality, and they conflict with each other, it is impossible for the brain, it is impossible for the mammal to do anything that's going to satisfy and deal with all of these different systems together. And because of that sort of constitutive impossibility at the level of our emotional inheritance, there's always going to be some affect that is residually there. There's always going to be some kind of unpleasure or some sort of excess excitation that you can't get rid of simply because there's always going to be some level and some degree of conflict, especially in the complicated human world we find ourselves in. And for me, that's the kind of bedrock of jouissance, this necessary, ineliminable surplus of affect that is there because it is impossible to get rid of it because of this sort of built-in sort of conflict among these systems. And from there, kind of work up as this sort of gets further complicated by learning, by motor systems, and by culture, and by interactions with interpersonal relationships, and how this sort of surplus of affect sort of is interwoven throughout the entire brain's operations, not sort of beyond an attempt at homeostasis.
Amazing. Yeah, I love how you get there.
Yeah,
You could see the theory. I could see the theory.
it's and I like it because some folks they try and in a way it's an attempt to move against the idea that some people seem to have and will argue that, well, you only get this drive stuff and all the psycholytic stuff because of language. And not to say that I don't think there's a ton of unique dynamics and very important stuff that comes up through language, especially as clinically associated. But then it kind of like punts back the question, well, what was there before language?
Hmm.
Presumably, language only came into existence at some point in evolution. Where did language come from? And I mean, Lacan's answers for this are more or less theological. Well, in the beginning was the word, and we can't go beyond that. And well, from a scientific standpoint, that's not exactly a satisfying answer.
Mm-mm.
So it's this kind of attempt to sort of work it from the ground up to show that, well, no, the sort of the animal that we like to kind of compare ourselves with as, it's somehow in touch with its instincts and in touch with the world in a way that humans aren't because humans speak. Well, that animal is also not exactly having the perfect time of perfect homeostasis. Animals will do all sorts of odd things in unique conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that idea. Like, but the word wasn't the first thing. So let's think about that. And yeah, and of course, there's all kinds of communication. You could say, okay, well, we're all enveloped in language now, sure, but yeah, that doesn't mean that that there's nothing beyond it, that there's not something. Yeah, I've always had a problem with that with the Lacanian theory is the focus on solely on language in that way, and that like when they say, oh, but we agree the unconscious is structured like a language, it's like. I could see part of it is, but I don't think all of it is. So it's like I like to think of like the way I think of science too is like yeah, there's a structure there that you can look at and try to understand things in science, in language, in physics, etc., chemistry, whatever. But these are like building blocks, but it's like the idea of like a house and a home. Like that's the structure of the home, and you can look at the walls and the ceiling and everything, but there's space in the home. There's feeling in the home. There's more to it than just the building blocks themselves. And that's the problem I feel like sometimes science gets to like, oh, but it's only what it's made of. But of course it's more. And I feel like you can do that with language too, and focus too much on the building blocks of language and not kind of getting the whole picture.
Yeah, and like you were saying with you can look at things from multiple angles. That
Hmm.
they don't have to be exclusive. You can think about it from behavioral standpoints, and well, in a unfortunate language, speaking is a kind of behavior. I don't like saying speaking behavior, but that's the way sort of behaviorists will talk about it. But yeah, you can think about these from multiple perspectives. That there are other behaviors, like you said, there are feelings and complex feelings that don't always seem sort of indexable to the play of the signifier or resolvable in that way. I'm reading have you seen the I have it right here, this book. Here I'm advertising someone else's book.
No, but I just ordered that actually because sometimes I can order books from Routledge that I want to have people on the podcast, and I just ordered a few, and that's one of the ones I ordered.
Okay,
Good.
great. It's wonderful. I love seeing these little snippets of how people talk about analyses, and one kind of makes the point that one of infamously one of Lacan's most sort of infamous interventions was not speaking. This is the Gestapo example. It's from the film The Rendezvous. I don't know French. Chez Lacan. Where a patient is talking how she would wake up every morning at 5 o'clock. She had lived through sort of Nazi occupation of France, and she says that's when the Gestapo would come. And in French, it's Gestapo, the Gestapo. And look, when she says that and how she keeps waking up with the symptom, Lacan jumps up from his seat and he strokes her on the cheek.
Mm.
And when I've shared this example with Anglophone neuropsychoanalytic colleagues, they're like, yeah, but like, let's be real, what would you actually do today? Because you can't do that. So they're like, what are these crazy Lacanian interventions? But this She interprets it as geste à peau. Sort of, it's like a touch on the cheek or like a gesture on the cheek, and it transforms the symptom. She doesn't quite have that same anxiety and that pain. And yes, it's sort of punning on the signifier, but the intervention itself is not spoken.
Hmm.
He makes an act, and so or it's also it's not like sort of cutting the session at a certain point in her speech so that she thinks about the word that she just said. And she talks about how there's residual feeling on the body, and so it's linguistic, but it's sort of language interacting and intersecting with a whole field of bodily sensation and all these other things that I think it makes these room for kind of enriching this Lacanian idea of like a language and how the unconscious is structured that way.
I love that example. And that's why I think it's so important to read things that aren't exactly the texts. Like I love reading letters and memoirs and journals and things like that because you get such a bigger picture as well. And I feel like a lot of like what people who say they're following Lacan or following Freud would do as interventions or say you can or cannot do is not actually what Freud and Lacan did. So it's like the theory that they said to do that other people have turned it into over decades, isn't exactly what they were actually doing. And I love reading like Betty Milan's book where she talks about her analysis. Because when I read that, I felt like, yes, this is like the Lacan that like this is like how I feel like he would be. So like it was really nice to read that and be like, yeah, this is yeah, how he feels like he would be, rather than like when it gets a little too like technical. And I was presenting once when I first moved to Sweden I was working on my book Scansion in Psychoanalysis and Art. So I was talking about how artists can use the cut as well in their work that can kind of create that same effect as a cut session in like the viewer or the participant or themselves through doing their work. And I presented it and like it was like to the philosophy department at Sodertone University or whatever. And so they were all like, "What?" And they were like, "How can you take something that's so like particularly applied, like Lacan's interventions that have to be done at an exact precise moment to have this effect, and the analyst has to know exactly this, and turn it into something that people could be doing like through art?" And I was like, I don't think that's how Lacan was working. I don't think he was like, okay, right here, go, like that, like clearly you're not a psychoanalyst. Like that's not how it actually works. You can learn how to do things through practice and training and your work, but you can't exactly teach how to find these moments. You have to learn to do them through like, yeah, doing the work. Becomes more
Yeah,
intuitive.
totally. And one of the things that I also like about putting the Lacan into dialogue with neuroscience and sort of seeing what the parallel is, it can sometimes help getting out of it's like, okay, scansion is this, you do it this way, or it's intended to have this effect within a certain, set of theoretical concepts and everything, from sort of standard Lacanian theory. But putting it into dialogue with neuroscience, it sort of opens up like, okay, well, what are we actually talking about here? Or like, what are we talking about in different words? And forcing myself to even like think about it that way. And so, but I was talking about sort of affects before. From another major element in the book is excuse me, Carl Friston's, who's an incredibly influential and famous neuroscientist, his free energy principle. And the idea essentially, it's a computational theory where the brain operates essentially to minimize uncertainty. That the brain is constantly not, the brain is not in direct contact or interaction with the world, that we actually anticipate, we actually predict and fill in our experience over and above, or it's our sort of best guess explanation of why we're getting the certain sensory input that we're getting. So the famous example of, like the blind spot.
Mm.
We technically have like a blind spot in our visual field where we actually have no sensory input. Yet we never have a sort of black hole in our visual field, most folks, because the brain predicts what the input in that area will be. And the same goes for sort of all of its experience at different levels, from basic perception all the way up to complicated interpersonal relationships. And you can already see sort of general link with sort of psychoanalytic ideas, and why a lot of folks in neuropsychoanalysis like this idea of sort of the predictive brain is that, well, we bring unconscious schemas, we bring templates, we filter our reality through the lens of fantasy. Sort of the fantasy structures our interpretation and our very experience of reality, because we're sort of constantly needing to fill in and deal with uncertainty, because, well, life is full of uncertainty, for better or worse. Um, and importantly, within this theory, and as linked to a lot of evidence in neuroscience on mechanisms of memory reconsolidation, so changing the brain's connections and changing, the connection between different brain areas, is that the updating and the changing of our predictions of the world and of our interpersonal world, of ourselves, our predictions of, okay, who am I? Okay, I'm this person with a certain history and all this stuff. all of that is influenced and updated through uncertainty. Basically, through surprise, especially and most importantly, affect as surprise. Affect is surprising. It signals that, oh, there's something that I need to attend to. There's something that I need to deal with, something that is deviating from my expectations. Again, to go back to that basic level, if I innately want to be safe from harm, and now there's someone coming at me with a knife, I infer that that's not very good. That's going to be bad for my safety. I'm going to attend to that, and I'm going to do something to deal with that. Or likewise, if you're in, say, a relationship and you feel a certain kind of negative way and you're not quite sure why, but there's some stuff that the other person does that you kind of infer to be signs of this and that and the other. Well, that's a certain kind of affect that's signaling that, okay, there's something that you're not quite getting, something you're not dealing with, and you're feeling that uncertainty, and that it drives you to do something. The idea is that it's through uncertainty that all of this updating and change happens. And when sort of reading that and thinking about, okay, well, what is really the essence of these crazy Lacanian interpretations? They're surprising.
Mhm.
They're really, really surprising. What is the punctuation or the scansion if not the patient is talking, they say something surprising, and the analyst, ends the session before the patient can kind of cover their tracks and talk their way out of it, and kind of patch it all up in a very nice bow. That it leaves the person with that uncertainty, but an uncertainty that like, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't expect to say that, or oh, there's this maybe this sort of linguistic uncertainty. I said one thing, but then when the analyst repeated that word, I heard the multiple meanings. In other words, there's uncertainty in, oh, what did I actually mean? That doesn't kind of get nailed down. And it's by sort of mobilizing uncertainty that these Lacanian interventions do their thing. And
Mhm.
so I talk about that in relation to the neuroscience and how the mechanism of these Lacanian interventions is to harness uncertainty,
Mhm.
is to harness uncertainty within the analytic session, beyond, in a way, beyond kind of content interpretations or things like that. And then going back to the Lacanian stuff, it's like, okay, well, there's many things that the analyst might do that provoke uncertainty in the patient, not only scansion and punctuation, but sort of to encourage kind of flexibility in how one can interact with a patient. And all sorts of things that can generate uncertainty that, as you're saying, you don't know beforehand,
Mhm.
always. You don't always, you can't predict that because precisely you're dealing with something that's not predicted, that's uncertain. And so you need to kind of work with that and handle that in yourself as well.
Exactly. And when you described it, it reminded me of what you were talking about in the beginning with the kind of seeking behavior, where it kind of jolts this kind of curiosity, this like surprising curiosity and uncertainty that gets you, yeah, gets you thinking, gets you engaged.
Totally, yeah, and there's it's a great link because from the neuroscience stuff we see that, okay, uncertainty can feel differently. There are different ways of feeling this uncertainty, and in the best of cases, this kind of line, I forget, I don't know if it's Lacan himself or if it's from Bruce Fink's kind of discussions, but the uh, hopefully the symptom is a form of enjoyment, and but hopefully analysis allows you to enjoy your enjoyment, at least a little bit, or in some ways. And yeah, that there is always going to be some residual excess, but perhaps the way that it's felt or the stance toward it can change, where it's less a cause of intense suffering, and you can sort of derive some kind of enjoyment, not necessarily always feeling positive, but some change that can happen, where it's not this kind of oppressive suffering that is debilitating in a way that you can maybe have some either optimism with it or perhaps some kind of play with it, where you can play with that uncertainty rather than be crushed by it.
Wonderful. And I also want to make sure that we get to your paper in rendering unconscious because you wrote a great little paper for the first rendering unconscious book, this one, which came out in 2019. but one was li very limited edition and sold out and also had to be ordered from Sweden because it was not on Amazon and stuff. But now it's come out in this special kind of edition as two volumes, and you're in the first volume. And yeah, it's a wonderful paper about organizing a psychoanalytic group at your college. And I love this kind of, yeah, I love when people figure out how to do something, get it going, and then share that with others so that other people can be inspired to do something similar. So I want to make sure to give it a shout out.
Yeah, and also a shout out to you in the Rendering Conscious book. I that is my first publication, I believe.
Very
Uh,
nice.
so I look at that with a lot of sort of gratitude and appreciation and everything. But yeah, and I remember very fondly that group, and above all, my own surprise at the number of people who were interested, and it was crazy. Because, like I said, at my undergraduate, things were quite siloed, at least with regard to psychoanalysis, and then it's like wow, there's all these professors and students from like German studies and psychology and modern culture and media and like literature and like the medical school and like so like all these people who had no idea anyone else was there. I was surprised even faculty who were working in neuroscience. Sorry, that's a good slip. Faculty working in psychoanalysis who didn't know about other faculty who were doing psychoanalysis stuff. So I was like, oh my gosh, you guys really didn't even know you were here. And so it was just great to kind of bring people together, and yeah, I kind of shared that hope that that this is possible with some elbow grease and a lot of emails, honestly, just to people to like kind of bring people together, get people talking, and I can kind of see that sort of thread in myself and kind of what I'm doing with the book and now too. It's like yeah, like we can talk to each other. We can have, people from different backgrounds, either within psychoanalysis, within different disciplinary approaches to psychoanalysis. So, there were like, artists who are into psychoanalysis, literature people into psychoanalysis, fortunately, psychology people who are into psychoanalysis coming at it from very different lenses. But, yeah, we all have something to kind of contribute and share with each other that can be very generative in a way that I think is much better than saying like, no, this is the only way to do it. And, this stuff is irrelevant and everything that it's kind of a call for yeah for more interdisciplinary thinking and I don't I forget if you had a Darien leader on but like his jouissance book
Hmm.
I think is a wonderful example of sort of the critique of like hey this concept has become very kind of siloed within the walls of Lacanian theory and like hey we have a lot to learn from non-Lacanian analysis from child development studies, and there's a section of the book where I kind of talk about his critique and put it in relation to like, well, yeah, look, we kind of get this plurality of concepts or this sort of more dialectical thinking of jouissance by putting it into dialogue with these other people, with these other ideas. And yeah, I get joy out of kind of sharing those efforts of bringing people together and to think, not necessarily to agree on everything, but to put these into sort of new perspectives and new light.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful example of if there's something you're interested in, there's going to be other people who are also interested. And if that there's not already like a space created for it, then create the space for it and people will come, you know? And you did that. And you're also like bridging things with your new book. It's like you see Mark Solms, but it's not Lacanian, you know? It's like you're like, okay, people are doing neuropsychoanalysis, but they're not really connecting it with Lacanian concepts per se. So this is something that I have particular niche interest in these kinds of things, and I can bring them together and create that. You know, you see something, a space for something, and you fill that space, you create that space. And I think that's such a great quality, and I just hope to inspire more people to do that. That's what the podcast is about. Like, look, there's so many different perspectives, and you can learn from all these different people that you may not otherwise encounter their ideas because they're from different fields or different walks of life and worldviews. And same thing with Das It started the same way. Like, why are we all in these psychoanalytic institutes that don't speak to one another and are all kind of like Darian was pointing out, like it becomes like dead when you're just like talking within this little group about these same theories. The theories theories kind of lose their meaning because they just become this like jargony words and doesn't really feel like it has that kind of seeking life and engagement and surprise anymore. So like, but like, yeah, if you put someone whose object relations or modern psychology with a Jungian and a Lacanian and a Freudian and ego psychologist, you put them all in the same room, you know, you can get some interesting dialogue. Throw a neuropsychologist there too, right? Um, and so, yeah, so I really like those kinds of spaces, and I like that. I love that you're doing that with your work, and I'm happy that I got to support it.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's I agree. You know, that's one great thing about the podcast. You have people from different backgrounds, and then you put these into kind of dialogue, and it's incredibly generative. And yeah, in a way that I'm glad that m most people I've kind of shared these ideas with, at the very least, kind of walk away thinking like, okay, yeah, maybe there is something that maybe there is some room for a bridge there. And not that just not just to say this is coming, all the Lacanians who don't like hearing anything else, especially anything biological, but on the flip side too, because in sort of the as you were saying, in a lot of the neuropsychoanalytic work, there's very few people who are doing anything Lacanian, and there's many reasons for that. In part, just sort of the sort of cultural around it and sort of where this finds itself. There's a couple of other people, but there's not many. Um, and one of the things that comes up a lot whenever there are Lacanian ideas that are put forward. A lot of people will say, that okay, yes, there's lots of stuff that are language, and then there are examples of these sort of like metaphoric interpretations and sort of metonymy and polysemy that come up from sort of common Lacanian examples. But a lot of folks in neuropsychoanalysis will sort of say, well, yes, but the child only starts speaking around, 2, 3, thereabouts. There's a ton of stuff prior to language. There's all of these emotions that are happening in animals who don't have language, presumably. There's all these things in, these other kinds of memory systems and motor systems that happen prior to language dynamics. And so often there's kind of like a critique and sort of a like, okay, yeah, there's this Lacan stuff, but it's not really there. And one of the things that, again, I kind of argue throughout the book is that, and Lacan is very specific on this, he says the unconscious is structured like a language, not by language. He says that
Mm.
explicitly. And he says, like, no, all of you misunderstand me. Like I said, like a language. In other words, as this sort of differential combinatory system of oppositional elements, and that's why he does all this sort of math stuff and topology. It's not equal to language. And I make that argument through the book that there are multiple brain systems that, when you look at it from a certain lens, they are linguistically organized in this sense of consisting of oppositional elements
Mm.
that have ambiguity in them, that aren't fixed to a determinate either representation or behavioral response or output or what have you. In other words, not like a perfect link between a signifier and a signified. No, they're many brain systems have this oppositional language-like quality to them, and so the ideas that we have of okay, how do you work with a language-like system psychoanalytically? They can apply to more than just literal language.
Mm.
When we look at it through the brain, and I think again, it's kind of like a, well, how exciting is it to think about all of our behaviors as language-like? How
Mhm.
exciting is it to think about even affects as having this oppositional differential quality? Like I've been saying, seeking feels fundamentally different from, fear. And those have, the response that you have for all those things can change and can be learned over time. That there's this sort of slippage of how you feel and how you act when you feel that feeling. And so to think of affects like as linguistically organized. I think it's just so exciting and new as new ways of thinking that can come from putting this Lacanian idea into dialogue with basic emotion neuroscience that normally doesn't kind of come into contact with each other.
Yeah, and see, that makes sense to me. I understand that. It's like also it's like how stars and atoms, it's like the things it's all in the same universe. So of course it's gonna be similarly mirrored. That makes sense. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. I like it. Well, keep doing what you're doing. Congratulations on your new book.
Well, thank you.
And anytime you have anything coming up in the future, just let me know. I know you've done some events recently. Didn't you do one with the Lacan in Scotland and with the Freud Lacan Institute in Ireland?
There've been a couple of events that are kind of talking about sort of parts of the book or sort of offshoots from it, talking about what I just kind of mentioned, sort of affects as linguistically organized, or some of the jouissance stuff. Again, speaking about sort of institutional siloing, it's been heartening to see many groups that are kind of open to sort of having these ideas being put together. I think it's exciting, as a young person, sort of coming into the world of psychoanalysis. It's exciting to kind of see people who are open to having people from different backgrounds, on podcasts, or giving talks in a way that is generative. And I think that's very valuable in general for the field, to sort of breathe life into it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. So anytime you want to come back, just be in touch. And yeah, is there anything else you wanted to mention in our last minute?
I think that's it. But yeah, but just thanks so much, Vanessa, for having me on, and for the invitation years ago for the on the Rendering Conscious book, and for having me on today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Wonderful. And I'll send you the link as soon as it's up.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye bye.